Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in Ukeru's new series on trauma-informed changemakers. We hope through these conversations that we will help to shine a spotlight on individuals who are driving meaningful progress in reducing the use of restraint and seclusion, and who are helping to create environments in schools and elsewhere of comfort versus control. My name is Kim Sanders, and I am the president of Ukeru Systems. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. We have taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel and dial in the information as displayed. We are eager for this to be an interactive session as possible. You will have the opportunity to submit questions today, and the presenter will then be happy to answer them toward the end. Please use the questions panel of your control panel. You can see your questions anytime, and we will collect those. And again, we're going to try to save about the last 15 minutes for those questions. In addition, we welcome you to join us through our conversation on social media using the hashtag starts with you. Also, just want to let you know of a couple other things. If you would like a certificate of completion, you can request that. And we'll also make sure that we have presentation posted afterwards on our website so that you can watch it again or you can share it with others. We try to do that by the end of the week if possible. If you're interested in continuing education credit, you can also contact us and we will help get that paperwork to you. So today we are so fortunate to be joined by Guy Stevens, whose son Cooper has led him on an unexpected journey of advocacy in his hometown of Calvert County, Maryland. The work he is doing will likely have an impact well beyond his own backyard. Today we will hear about his story and the promise he made to his son to make classrooms safer for students and teachers, and how he co-founded the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and how teachers, administrators, and parents can make a change in their own district. I couldn't be happier to have Guy join us today. Welcome, Guy. It's so good to have you with us.
Hey, Kim, it's great to be here with you today. I'm really excited to have a discussion with you.
Yeah, so again, I feel like we've had many discussions, and I feel like I know you so well, and I can't wait for you to just sort of share your story with the folks that are listening today. So how about we start there?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, and I appreciate that. You and I have had a number of discussions for sure, and really happy to have this one and kind of share some of the things that I've learned kind of on my journey that may be beneficial to others. So my interest in restraint and seclusion started kind of with an unexpected story, or unexpected journey, I guess is the best way to put it. I have a son, Cooper, who you can see there, hopefully in the photograph. That was Cooper and I in a concert this past summer. And Cooper is 14 years old. He's on the autism spectrum with some anxiety and ADHD. He had been in a special program in our county called the ISLE program, which was an intensive structured learning environment from about first grade until fifth grade, and did really, really well. In fact, he had done so well, he had progressed to be in inclusion classes for, I think, all but one of his academic classes at that point. Unfortunately, at the end of fifth grade, we had some events that caused things to kind of really have some difficulty. He had a teacher that he had a fabulous relationship with that he had worked with for about 2.5 years, and she got involved in an auto accident and never returned back to the classroom. And unfortunately, the school was very they weren't really telling the kids what happened, and there was a lot of kind of uncertainty about what was going on. We eventually found out what had happened and that she was in a serious accident and wasn't going to be returning. But at that time, when suddenly no longer anchored by this really strong relationship, he began to have some problems. And that led to behaviors we hadn't seen in 5 years since he was in the first grade, including things like elopement, where he became overwhelmed and he went and hid in a bathroom. Unfortunately, without the support they had previously had, even though the school was trying to offer him support, without the relationship and that well-established support, things started to take a turn in the wrong direction. And at the end of 5th grade, he was restrained on 2 occasions, and it was very traumatic for him. I'll never forget going to the classroom the day that he had been restrained one afternoon, and he was kind of sitting in the corner, and just I saw him in a condition I'd never seen him before. He had kind of torn things up and thrown things, and he was so distraught about what had happened after being restrained. And at that point in my life, I had never heard the terms restraint and seclusion as they would pertain to a classroom setting. So this was all kind of new to me at that point. Well, if we fast forward, he decided that he didn't want to go back to school after all of this happened, after 2 events where he was physically restrained and put into a classroom. And we did a lot of soul searching and ended up homeschooling him for 2 years. At the end of that 2 years, he decided he wanted to try to go back to public school again. And this was a little over a year ago. Well, spring a year ago. So about 18 months ago, I guess, he decided he wanted to go back to public school. We worked really hard to get him back into a public school setting, develop an IEP, talk about what had happened with him and the trauma he had previously been through. I'd done a lot of advocacy training because I've always tried to advocate for my son and make sure that he was getting what he needed. And we really did a lot to try to set him up to be successful. And unfortunately, despite our best efforts, when he went back into the public school setting last fall, the fall a year ago, things did not go well. He was in that public school setting for about 15 days, and he was restrained and secluded on at least 4 occasions. We believe it happened more than that. But only 2 of those were actually officially recorded in paperwork, which unfortunately is not too terribly uncommon. And this was very, very traumatic on my son. And when this happened to him, again, he was at the point where he didn't want to go back to school. We ended up last year for the remainder of the year doing what they call home and hospital, where they had a teacher come out to our home to work with him. But it was very traumatic. We went through counseling. And in the meantime, I began to kind of look more into restraint and seclusion, try to become more educated about it. And as I did, I knew what happened to my son should never have happened. It was not an appropriate way to be working with him. It was not necessary. And I remember sitting actually in my room one day talking to him, and I said, Cooper, what happened to you should have never happened to you. It's not okay what happened to you. And I told him, I said, I'm going to do whatever I can within my power to try to make sure it doesn't happen to you again or doesn't happen to others. And that's what kind of started this journey that I've been on to advocate against the use of restraint and seclusion in our schools, on a local level, at a state level, and at a federal level. So that's what got us started. And I can tell you more about kind of what I've done since then. But one of the things that I learned, and this next slide shows it well, is when I began doing research on my son's situation. Initially, I was one parent that had a bad experience and was isolated from any other knowledge of this happening within my state. I was able to get my hands on a report that actually was the first of its kind in Maryland. Maryland in 2017 put out legislation to say we're going to start recording restraint and seclusion data. Last year was the first year the report went out. It wasn't widely publicly available, but I managed through a connection to get a copy of this report. And when I got it, I looked through it, and it didn't say anything that initially alarmed me. But as I looked at the numbers, I began to put them on an Excel spreadsheet, and then I began to graph them. And what I quickly learned is that my county, while about 15th or 16th in size in terms of the counties in the state, they were number 1 in the use of seclusion, number 2 in the use of restraint. So suddenly I had this picture where it wasn't just us having a bad experience, rather there was something systematically going on in our county. They were overusing these practices. And that began a journey where I began working with our Board of Education. There were several news stories that were featured about our story on Fox News and a local news outlet as well, which put pressure on the board to really want to work, potentially work with me. And ultimately, we formed a committee, to look at restraint and seclusion in the county. That kind of, began to take me to where I began to look for alternatives and to the point of finding out about Ukeru. So that was kind of the start of our journey. And I will say that our committee has had influence, and we've actually passed a new policy, which has been fantastic. We passed a new policy that looks to reduce the use of restraint, eliminate the use of seclusion within 2 years, and it's a very positive step. And I'll never forget when we got that policy passed, and it wasn't an easy process. I don't want to make it sound like it was. I was working with organizations to get support, so I was reaching out to groups like COPA and the Maryland Coalition of Families and Parents Place and the ARC, asking them to write letters to my Board of Education. I was meeting individually with members of the board. There was a lot of work that happened to get to that point. But I'll never forget when we finally got the policy approved, my son looks at me and goes, "Okay, so you're done with all the seclusion and restraint stuff, right?" And I said, "Well, Cooper, no." I said, if we were to move tomorrow to a different county or a different state, it could happen again. So, my journey now has kind of gone a little bit more into a point where it's a larger effort, kind of at a state level, at a federal level, and trying to influence change. So one of the things that I did initially in this process was I was doing a lot of research, and I'll get to this and how it connects me to Ukeru in a second. But I was doing a lot of research to figure out what were alternatives to restraint and seclusion. What does the data look like? What does the data look like nationally? And there's a lot of interesting things you learn, like restraint and seclusion disproportionately affect kids with disabilities and minorities. As I began to look more and more into that, I was looking for resources to help find information. And I was finding some, but I wasn't finding all the things I was hoping to find. And eventually I was finding enough that I thought it was worth sharing. So I formed a group back in March called the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. And the idea of that group was to share with others that might be going through this same kind of thing, that the resources I was finding, and really also I think one of the purposes behind the Alliance was to let people know that are going through this, like I was, that one, you're not alone, and two, you have more power to influence change than you might think. And we wanted to encourage people to do that. So we started this alliance, and we're heading up to about 3,000 people on the Facebook page. We have a website as well, which is endseclusion.org. But it's been a really valuable tool for not just myself, but a lot of others. And we've got a number of contributors now that are part of the group that are producing original content to share. We've recently had a great article on behaviorism, but we've got some really great, great resources out there. And we want to kind of empower people to make change and also to connect with each other. I did a little thing recently where I was asking people where they were from and encouraging them to connect with each other. And I get messages from people all the time that are like, "Gee, we're in Canada, and I just connected with somebody on your site that's also from Canada, then lives down the street from me, and we're working together now." So it's to encourage people to try to influence change. So that's a very light version of kind of like our story and some of the changes that we've been trying to influence, and again about the Alliance.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think, there's no doubt that the effort that you have put into this so far and the impact that you've been able to have, again, so outside of your backyard, as well as right there in your home community. But let's talk a little bit to us about how things changed for Cooper. So, I know that in talking with you that you're a big advocate for making sure that we have trauma-informed approaches in place. So can you just talk a little bit about how that actually relates real life to what you've seen with Cooper?
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'm going to back up just a hair, just to hit that point about how I became aware about Ukeru, because I think that's important. And then I'll talk about kind of where we are with Cooper and about the trauma-informed piece of that. But, the connection to Ukeru was really important because when I began to advocate for change and began to advocate for something different in our county, saying, hey, we've got a problem, we need to do something, I didn't just want to be somebody bringing a problem. I wanted to have ideas of possible solutions. So I did a lot of research trying to find different approaches that might be helpful in working with kids that had challenging behaviors, because that's what we were finding, is that it was often kids with disabilities or kids that had been through trauma that were having these issues. So I began to dig in, and that's when I first learned about Ukeru. And I began at the website, and I was reading about, well, it's an alternative to restraint and seclusion, and it's trauma informed. And I began to read all the principles, and they were really connecting with me. And I remember seeing a video of you talking, and you were talking about kind of the comfort versus control. And I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. So here I am, just average dad. I'm not a school district, but I tried to reach out to Ukeru thinking, well, gee, I wonder if they would talk to me. And much to my delight, you responded, and you were happy to have a phone call with me. And I'll never forget that first phone call. You spent probably a good hour and a half talking to me. I explained to you what was going on. And I can't tell you how helpful that was to me in my journey, because suddenly I had somebody that represented an alternative, and we were talking it through. So that's kind of how I found out about Ukeru. And, as you recall, I began working with you and trying to get your help to bring it to our school district. And we've actually been successful with that. We actually now have a pilot program where 4 schools are doing the Ukeru program. So it's been really great progress to see. So anyway, I just wanted to go back to that for a second. And I as mentioned on this slide, I am also working with some of the members of the Alliance in, working on a greater agenda at a national level, because I do believe that, I've done a lot of research on this, and I can find nothing to support the use of seclusion in our schools. And, it is regulated elsewhere, whether it be mental health or law enforcement. There's no regulation is related to schools. I'm a firm believer that seclusion should go away in our school environments. And I believe that restraint should be very rare, and that's why I love alternatives like Ukeru, which offer alternatives to these other kinds of interventions. So anyway, we're making a lot of progress. But to get back to my son and kind of trauma, we know that the use of seclusion and restraint is traumatic. And you and I have talked about this. It's not just traumatic on the kids, it's also traumatic on the teachers or the aides or others that might be helping with the procedures, or even just witnessing the procedures, even other students. I've known siblings of students that were secluded that happened to hear or see part of it, were severely traumatized. And, so we know that it's very traumatic. My son was not able to go back to a traditional school setting after that happened to him. And, of course, we can get more into the trauma piece of this in a second, but in our story, he's now in a non-public school. So in Maryland, a non-public is an option, and across, probably most states, they may use different terminology, but for kids that aren't able to do well in a public school setting, we sometimes think about non-public schools. Of course, I'm a big fan of inclusion, and I'm a big fan of, educating our children in the least restrictive environment. But once a child has been through school-based trauma, like my son was, he's not ready to return to a traditional school. We were very fortunate to find a school in Maryland. It's called the Pathway School in Anne Arundel, which is a very different school than most traditional classroom environments. They actually have a model where they work one-on-one with a lot of children. Now, what they try to do is ultimately get them in small groups and then kind of get them reacclimated to a more traditional environment. But my son works primarily one-on-one with what's called a community support specialist. He has a special educator. He has speech and language support and therapy as well. But when we first sat down with that team, well, even before I sat down with that team, I met with the principal, and we talked about the importance of kind of a trauma-informed approach, and we talked about the importance of relationships in working with my son. And I've also become a big fan of the work of Dr. Ross Green, and we talked about kind of the collaborative proactive solutions model and things like that. But at our first IP meeting, we talked about the most important thing to do getting Cooper started again was to form a solid relationship kind of built on trust. And, that gets us very heavily into this idea of trauma-informed care, because, we're dealing with more and more children in school settings that have experienced some kind of trauma. Just like with seclusion restraint, if you have a disability or you're a minority, your likelihood to have been influenced by trauma is even greater. And, in our case, we had school-based trauma, which makes it difficult to then get a child back into a school setting. So he is doing absolutely fantastic right now. He made the honor roll recently. He thinks very highly of his teachers and all the staff that are working with him, but they follow a trauma-informed model. And they know, in our case, kind of some of the trauma that he had been through, which has been really, really, really helpful. Kim, that I had the opportunity to attend the Ukeru training, which was fantastic. Because as somebody that was advocating for change, I wanted to have a better sense of how it worked and what the program was. And one of the things I love about Ukeru is that it is a trauma-informed approach. While you offer an option for crisis management, really looking at the trauma-informed approach, you're looking at building relationships, you're looking at building trust, you're looking at helping children to feel a sense of safety. And in doing these things, are reducing the likelihood of the need of crisis management. So I really enjoyed getting to attend the training, and as well, I've had an opportunity to attend some other training, and I found some really interesting things about trauma. You by far are much more of an expert than I am here, but the interesting thing is that trauma can feed into more trauma, and I think we see that oftentimes with our children that have disabilities or have difficulty in certain areas where they may have already been through some trauma, and there are physiological effects of this trauma. The trauma can affect the brain and the way the brain responds to re-traumatization or other situations. And I mentioned my son in 5th grade, and I talked about the elopement. And if you think about what elopement is, it's a stress response. It's a fight or flight where my son takes flight, and unfortunately, then after taking flight was traumatized further by the use of restraint. So at any rate, it creates this interesting cycle. And one of the things that I'm sure that we've that you would be able to talk about at much more length than I could, but is that once traumatized, these changes can happen to your brain and the way that your brain responds to things. And when you're in that fight or flight mode, you're not able to access that, frontal cortex and make logical and rational decisions. And oftentimes the way we work with children in a school setting, we're not being informed by those things. And they're so important. If we want to reduce the need for crisis intervention, we've got to have that trauma piece firmly ingrained in the approach that we take, which is, again, what I really liked about Ukeru, and what I love about, I'm quoting you frequently on things like, comfort versus control. When kids are having problems, we need to make them feel safe, because that sense of safety is so critical.
Yeah, and I mean, again, well, number one, we're so happy that Cooper is on there and he's sort of in a place where he does feel safe and that he's doing well. And again, it was a delight to have you join us. And again, when I'm just sitting here listening to you talk about trauma-informed approaches and how this relates to your son and other students, I feel like and you and I have had this conversation that we can overlay just about everything that you just talked about with, again, what teachers and aides and other, personnel in schools feel as well. Because the bottom line is we all want to feel safe.
Right.
And,
right.
When we all experience those situations that, call them what you will, a crisis and an outburst, a challenging time, or a general struggle in our life, so often all of us resort back to that need to feel safe and comforted. And so a lot of times, even those of us are more in the role of being a provider or a teacher, that if our amygdalas are firing and we don't feel safe, we can't be at our best.
Right.
Or I guess you could say the people who are counting on us the most.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really has been such a, I guess, like a piece of the bedrock of Ukeru, is that, you know, for us, we think the first thing we need to do is to make sure everybody feels safe. And then we can teach all kinds of different strategies and techniques and coping skills and all the good stuff. But until you get that, you're not going to make a lot of progress. It's hard to get through, because like you said, there are physical things happening to our brains.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that has been just amazing. Again, in my discussions with you, just to have those conversations, and I think, you know, for me personally, it's just such a wonderful experience to talk to a person that's in that position of a parent that is so open to hearing how the teachers and the aides must be feeling as well.
Right. I think that's a really important point, and I think, you know, I think you know this from you know, our conversations in the past, but you know, I agree with you heavily. I mean, I've talked to a lot of parents, and I've seen a lot of stories over the last year related to seclusion and restraint, and some of them will very quickly kind of, you know, have a visceral effect on you, that you just feel this outrage and this anger. And you know, I mean, it's hard not to. And when what happened to Cooper, don't get me wrong, I was very angry and upset about what happened and knew that it was wrong. But at the same time, you know, in addition to being a big fan of Ukeru, I'm also a big fan of Dr. Ross Greene. And I think the approach he recommends, kind of the collaborative proactive solutions approach, I think is a great way of working with kids to kind of build relationships. And again, it all comes back to this relationship piece. But one of the things that's kind of one of the foundational pieces of Dr. Greene's philosophy is this idea that kids do well if they can. And if we think that kids do well if they can, the question you then begin to ask yourselves is if kids aren't doing well, why aren't they doing well? Are they lagging? Do they have lagging skills or unsolved problems? How can we help the child do well? And it sounds like a very simple thing, but the alternative is what we often see in schools, which is kids do well if they want to. And if you believe that kids do well if they want to, then your ideology is they're not motivated. So we need to offer them rewards or offer them punishments. And you know, for me, very much, I'm a firm believer in the idea that kids do well if they can, which takes us back to this idea that it's not just kids. Teachers do well if they can. So, you know, if teachers aren't doing well, and you know, I believe this to be true of the vast majority of professionals that are out there. And there's always outliers, but I believe that most teachers will do well if they can. And if they're not doing well, what are they lacking? Do they have a lagging skill? Do they not know about trauma-informed care? Do they not know about alternative ways to working with children? I think a lot of that is true. And you know, we want to look to say, well, it's special education is not properly funded. There's all these issues out there, and I agree. There's a lot of problems out there, but there's also a lot of things that individuals do even without all the supports. You know, they read, you know, up on things like you know, collaborative proactive solutions, or they advocate for training in their district. So there are things I think that teachers can do, but again, you know, that whole concept that, you know, by and large, you know, I don't think anybody really wants to restrain or seclude a child, but I think oftentimes it is the only tool in their toolbox. It's what they've been told to do. We've had teachers and others writing for our website that have told their stories, and their stories often start out that way, like, hey, you know, I got started in my career and this is what they taught me to do. I didn't think it was right, so I didn't do it. And you know, I found other ways of working with kids, and people are like, hey, why aren't you restraining and secluding? Well, I don't have to. But by and large, if you're told that this is the way to do things, very commonly it's the way that things get done. So, absolutely. You know, I think
if you're putting a system, I mean, if I just think about my own experience, like, sure, were there moments that I questioned what I did 30 years ago, you know, when I first started at Grafton? Absolutely. But then, and I think about it, and I think I was in this system that's what we all thought was how you were supposed to behave and respond when the kids we were working with had these, you know, pretty significant challenging behaviors. And so it's really hard for an individual to buck up against a system,
Right.
especially if you don't have the awareness that there is a better way. I mean,
That's
I
right.
think that for us is what we see so often, is that things now that may seem so simplistic to us and sort of like, well, of course there's a different way. Well, we only feel that way now because we've experienced it. If you've never experienced it, again, in a sense, you are a bit stuck. Like you're stuck in a sort of a narrow way of thinking, but it's not necessarily something that, it's not your fault.
Right.
It's
Right.
because it's not been presented to you yet. So like, it's sort of like, how do you know what you don't know?
Right. Well, and this is one of the reasons why the Grafton and Ukeru story were so compelling to me. I remember when I talked to you, Kim, initially, and you told me kind of your story and the story of Grafton and Ukeru, and how there was a point where you were restraining and secluding children a lot, and that led to a lot of issues. I mean, some of the compelling pieces that I've shared with school systems are some of the success stories that you've had. But before you had the success stories, you had lots of injuries, and you had high workman compensation premiums, and you had staff that weren't satisfied, and ultimately because of what was going on with your story, you developed Ukeru and you came up with this better approach, and you go 10 years down the road, and not only are you doing better working with the children that you're working with, you're saving money, you have fewer injuries, you have higher retention rates of staff, and that's the great part about this story, is that you can do the right thing and make a positive change all the way around. As you mentioned before, there are, and I've talked to them, there are educators and administrators and others that feel that they need restraint and seclusion in their toolbox to be safe, when in fact the data really tells a different story. The data really shows that using restraint and seclusion not only is more unsafe for the children, but also for the staff and for the teachers and whatnot. And your story really kind of helps to solidify that, to show, hey, look at 10 years out, where we are, and all of the improvements that we've made. So I really believe we can do the right thing and kind of benefit everyone in the system. But to do that, we need to work together to some degree, and it's not always easy, because sometimes there are interests that people have, and they don't realize all of the facts. So they may not realize that, well, gee, using these interventions can be more dangerous. So those are some of the messages we need to get across. And one of the things that we've encouraged people to do, and that I've learned from other people that have done as well, is we can begin with one teacher. We can begin with an IEP team. We can begin by sharing a book like Lost at School, or Beyond Behaviors by Mona Delahook, or even telling them about, hey, do you know there's alternatives? There's this thing called Ukeru.
Right.
Let me send you some links. Let me tell you about it. Let me reach out to Kim Sanders and say, hey, Kim, can you touch base with people? I mean, there are things that we can do to influence change, and I think that's really important. And you brought this up when we talked last time, but as a parent, I can be angry and I can go after the school, and hope that affects change, or I can try to work with others and affect a change by working with parents, working with members of the Board of Education, working with lawmakers, trying to collaborate. Now, that said, collaboration is not always a happy story. In my state, I continue to try to reach out to the Maryland State Department of Education and the Board of Education, and so far I've not had a whole lot of luck, but continue to try to kind of form partnerships and work together. And again, it takes different approaches at different periods of time, but I do think it's really important to make an effort. We're all in this together. On the Alliance, I mean, that's one of, I think, our core beliefs, is that we're not just an angry group that hates all teachers and hates anybody that's ever done restraint. We want to try to inform people of the alternatives. We want to try to influence change by working with people where possible from within the system. I'm always looking for stories from educators who Maybe they use restraint and seclusion, but they don't anymore because they found a better way, or maybe they've always had a really a good way. But I think that's an important thing, is to try to collaborate with who you can to affect change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think another piece of this, again, when I look back on my own experience at Grafton, is that for so long, even for myself, I felt like I had somewhat of a victim mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And being a victim of the children that were acting out and so challenging, or maybe who had physically hurt me, or, and I think that there comes a time, like, number one, I don't really think that any of us want to be the victim, but I think that so often it's easy to be the victim. Right. And so sometimes I see those parallels too, regardless if it's a child that's hurt you, or a teacher who's hurt your child, or, that anger sometimes it breeds out of this victim mentality. Mm-hmm. And I think that, everything that you talk about in the slide that's showing now, even, the engagement, the collaboration, a partnership, that when you can focus on what can I do to make a change, you actually are very empowering to yourself to get yourself out of that victim mentality. Right. That again, it's a bad cycle to get in. And I think that once you can do that, then my goodness, not only can you affect things for yourself and for your family, but the impact that you can have. I mean, again, I say this often, but it may sound a little corny, but like, you can impact the world. You can truly impact the world, but you can't do that when you're the victim. You just can't.
That's a great point. And I think, when you're a victim, you're often angry or maybe depressed, and what you're not is effective. And it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be depressed, but sometimes
absolutely
you've got to be able to be effective as well. And sometimes that means trying to put the feelings on the back shelf and to really think about how to be strategic, how to influence change. And, again, you talk about teachers, and I think you're right. I had many conversations in my own experience and conversations I've had with others where people look at the behavior of children with disabilities as willful and defiant, and don't realize that it is often a function of their disability. And, when they put children into situations where they're exposed to trauma, the irony there is that, of course, the trauma makes it more likely that they're going to behave in the ways that lead you to go to interventions that are going to re-traumatize them. So I think it's really important, even in the capacity of, if you're an educator, it's easy to attribute something to will that is a matter of skill or ability, or their ability to adapt, adaptively respond to a certain situation. I've always loved this, and I don't know even where the quote came from, but the idea that, that the kid's not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. So right. It is hard because, like you said, when you're in the midst of it, we have our own, as adults, we're also going to go in fight or flight or freeze kind of mode. So we've got to do all we can to continue to keep our frontal lobes working when we're going into situations that can evolve to crisis. Because, like you said, when the kids are at their worst, we need to do all we can to be at their best, which is why training like what Ukeru offers and the trauma-informed training is so important to helping people succeed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what other advice, do you have any other concrete advice for parents? Like, what can they learn from your experience?
So, again, the big point that I like to make is, one, you're not alone. There are a lot of other people that have either gone through this or are going through it. We see that on the Alliance all the time. We have a lot of conversations about people that are actively involved in situations like this. So you've got others that understand, because, if you're a parent of a child that has a disability, it can already be isolating to a degree. While your friends and family may not have children that have the same kinds of needs, you sometimes can feel a little bit alone and isolated. But when you have a child with a disability that goes through something like this, you're even a smaller subset of a smaller subset, and you can really feel isolated. And I did. I mean, certainly when what happened to Cooper happened to Cooper, I felt really like, oh, well, gee, maybe this is just us, until I began to dig in and look at the data and realize, oh, gee, it's not just us. Oh, wow, there's a problem here. So you're not alone, and you're more powerful than you think. But again, part of that gets to the point of being strategic and having a plan and thinking about how you can influence change. And there are a lot of different things that you can do to influence change. I've been working, I shared with you recently, I was kind of working on a little list. In fact, I published an article earlier today with some of these things, but there are a lot of things that you can do. So it can be simple things like, finding people at your school that agree with you. If your child is being restrained and secluded, there well may be somebody in that classroom that doesn't think it's the right approach. Find your allies, connect with other parents. Maybe it's a special education PTA or some other kind of group where you're able to connect with others that are having a similar experience. But again, there are things that you can do to influence your policy. And one of the things is know what your school system's policy is, know what your state's laws are in regard to things like restraint and seclusion, know what the federal guidance is, but you can begin by, even just sharing books with your IEP team or making a public comment at your Board of Education meeting. There are organizations out there that can help if you're in dire need of assistance. There are disability rights centers across the country. There are parent centers across the country. There are different places that you can go to get support, sometimes even legal support, if you need that. But do your research, know what kind of alternatives are out there, and hopefully people listening to this have already heard or maybe are hearing for the first time about things like Ukeru. Do your research and be able to bring solutions to the table. One of the things that'll happen is somebody will tell you about what your child did, and this is really tough because they're telling you what your child did and making you feel like, gee, here I am with this child that has this terrible behavior. And it's really tough. But if you can, and they may say, well, what else do you expect us to do? This is what happened. What do you expect us to do? Well, if you do your research and you look into things like Ukeru or collaborative proactive solutions, you can have an answer for that, and you can have a meaningful answer that may help them to find that there are better ways to go about things. So there are a lot of things you can do. You can do it at a local level, you can do it at a state level, you can do it at a federal level. Of course, the local level is where you'll see change happen the fastest. So I've been working locally, state and federal, but we've already changed our policy on a local level. That's great. Affecting the state or the federal level takes longer to do. There is most likely the Keeping All Students Safe Act, which is a bill that would prohibit the use of seclusion, reduce the use of restraint, and really try to put checks and balances in related to that, is likely to be reintroduced very soon. We actually met with Bobby Scott, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia recently. That bill's likely to be reintroduced. Call your congressmen, call your senators, ask them to support legislation. Join an organization like COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates. Great group. They're always, in fact, they've got a case related to the use of seclusion restraint that's active right now. There are a lot of resources out there. Join our Alliance page. Certainly we try to help people and point them in a good direction as well. So know that you've got power and you can make change. It doesn't mean you have to try to tackle everything at once, but beginning to do some of this, in our story, from the time that I set out to affect change, I mean, within 6 months we had a new policy. Now it was a lot of work and it's not easy. I have a full-time job and this has been like a second full-time job for me. But at the same time, it's really important because, at its worst, kids can be traumatized. they can be seriously injured, and there have been numerous deaths that have occurred from the use of restraint and seclusion as well. So we have to do better. We're in 2019. This is not an appropriate way to be working with kids. We've got to be aware of any kind of trauma background. We've got to follow kind of trauma-informed practices and work with kids and help them be successful.
Absolutely. And again, I would think for folks listening today, and if you're someone listening and you work at a provider type of organization, or you're actually a teacher or an aide in a school system, I think that there's things that you can definitely do, because now you're aware. I mean, I think, demand more training, make sure that you create an awareness with the leadership at where you might work that says, like, hey, look, we don't have to do this anymore. There are alternatives out there. There's ways that we can make sure that the kids are safe, but that we're safe too. I think, again, at the same time, you can speak up for yourself and sort of have a voice. Again, just like Guy and I have talked about earlier, you can do it in a way that is very collaborative, even inside the system that you're currently in. That you'd be shocked, even as an employee, the change that you can bring.
Yeah, and it's hard. And one of the sad truths is that both from a parent standpoint and an educator standpoint, people are sometimes afraid to come forward. People are afraid of retaliation. And then this sounds like I'm making things up, but it's not. There are people that come forward to bring forth concern about an issue and then feel that districts retaliate against them because of that. There are teachers that come forward and are afraid of retaliation, which is unfortunate and certainly shouldn't be happening. I would say, find a way to bring it forward, and it may require some creativity. But, certainly, I've talked to and been contacted by teachers that want to share their story, but they're kind of afraid to. I would encourage, whether you're a parent or a teacher or an aide or wherever you might be, if you think we can do better, and I think we can, if you think that, figure out a way that you can bring that forward. Find a parent that agrees with you. I mean, I've kind of said to the school, kind of joke before, like, how can I help? Like, do you need me to put pressure on? Is there somebody I can talk to about this? Because I'm happy to come forward as a parent, and I have no rules that govern me to say that I can't. Find if you're an educator, rather than when I said if you're a parent, find allies that might be in the school. If you're an educator, find allies that might be parents.
Absolutely. So let's see, we have, looks like we have, I don't know, about 13, 14 minutes left here. So Juliet's going to be helping us with questions today. And Juliet, how are we doing with questions, or we just need to make sure people know where to put their questions?
Yeah, just in case you've had any trouble posting a question, there may be a technical issue, I'm not sure. So if you have a question and you haven't been able to post it in the chat feature, please do feel free to ask that question on social media using the hashtag #StartsWithYou, and we will be looking on that for questions. And in the meantime, if you are able to, please just remember that there is a questions field in the GoToWebinar control panel. But right now we don't have any questions just yet. Kim, unless, Elena, unless yours, I think one may be coming in right now. But if you want to maybe keep going with the conversation, I'll keep monitoring for the questions, Kim.
That sounds great. And again, if folks are able to see the chat box, and you can send that to organizers or panelists, please feel free to use that as well. Yeah. So, Guy, you talked a little bit about your work with the federal legislation. I think that at this point, we're very hopeful that that'll get, I guess you could say, reinvigorated. That's definitely another way that both parents and employees and teachers can be involved. I know that the folks that are sort of, I guess you could say, behind the scenes, they would love to get that sort of groundswell going and get as many teachers and aides as involved in that legislation as well. I mean, if you dig into that a little bit and read, I mean, I just know from my involvement in that, the people working on that, although it might not be as transparent as we'd like it to be, again, a big piece of that is making sure that the teachers and aides have what they need. So I mean, I'm sure that you've heard that as well in your work on that legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when we went recently to Capitol Hill, one of the things that we wanted to bring forward was the fact that we've got this alliance, and we're hearing stories from all over the country. We wanted to say to Congressman Scott, like, if you're looking for people to provide testimony, let us know. We have a lot of stories, and I agree with you. I think it's important to tell stories from a bunch of different perspectives. Unfortunately, some of the unions seem to be very supportive of restraint and seclusion, but I think it's under the false assumption that it makes teachers and staff safer. And that's one of the messages I think we really need to get to people, is it doesn't. I mean, even if you think about the trauma part of this, as we re-traumatize kids by using restraint and seclusion, you're making them more likely to act in a way that is not the way you want them to act the next time something happens, because they're going to be hypervigilant in terms of their amygdala, and they're going to have anxiety, and they're going to be ready for fight, flight, or freeze. So I think it's very important that we try to really work with educators and help them understand that this isn't making them safer, that there are better ways. There are programs like Ukeru. There are approaches like the collaborative proactive solutions approach. There are a lot of different things that we can be doing.
Absolutely. So it looks like we had one question that came in, and we have someone who's asking if we are in any school districts in Texas. And I'm happy to tell you that in the new year, we are in talks with a school district in Texas. We'll be our first school district in Texas. I guess just in general, we should just let people know that Ukeru is being used as of today in over 190 organizations. Probably about a third of those are school districts across the country and in Canada, and it's growing. It's literally, I'm doing this webinar from Utah today, and it's growing daily. But yes, Texas, we are starting with a school district at the beginning of the year, and we have had a contract with the state of Texas and their adult state-supported living centers now for about 3 or 4 years. So we are very familiar with some of the systems in Texas and look forward to joining some school districts there. Let's see, there's another question here.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead, Juliet.
Oh, we did have another question come in. What are additional practical supports and frontline resources beyond training that people have needed?
Yeah, so again, I think that we can go back to beyond training. What people have needed, again, is the support of leadership. Again, I'm sure Guy has seen that basically you got to have that support from the top. And again, it's a lot more things than training. Just, I guess, if people have a support that there's a willingness to change the way of thinking and to sort of get out of just old systems. We also have seen that people are focusing a lot more on how do we take care of each other. That, again, of course, we want to take care of the students in the school, and we want to make sure, but again, there's this issue of safety for all. So what can we do that's trauma-informed for our employees? So it even gets back to that, if we're saying that we want to treat the students with a method of comfort versus control, we need to be able to treat our staff in that same manner. Now, please, we don't want anyone to think that doesn't mean that there's high expectations and limits and structure, but just like we think kids do best with healthy structure and limits, so do employees. But it's about the manner in which you deliver that to people. And so it should be in a method that's more comforting and trauma-informed for all.
Hey, if I can add something, Kim, to that, I think I talked to a teacher recently that told me about her experience, and she was a teacher in Florida. She had a classroom where She had a number of special education students that have been included in her classroom. She had very little training in working with kids that had some of the challenges that her children had. And she said, you know, from that moment, I knew I needed to do something. I knew I needed to figure out how to work with some of the kids that were in my class that I really wasn't prepared to. And she began by doing some of her own research. Eventually, she decided to get a degree, a master's in special education. But it can be something as simple as, you know, your own, you know, running your own classroom and doing your own, you know, trying your own thing. You know, 2 books, Lost at School by Dr. Ross Green and Beyond Behaviors by Mona Delahook. I would start with those. If I was a teacher that was having challenging behaviors in my classroom, I would start with those books and think about how I might implement something like that in my classroom, certainly while advocating to get the appropriate training kind of school-wide. But I think that, you know, sometimes there's this powerless feeling like, well, unless they make a systematic change, we can't do anything. And I would say that in many cases, you can do something locally. And we hear from teachers that have this experience, and then they become kind of the rock stars, where people are coming to them going, well, how were you able to do this? How were you able to work with this really challenging student? So, you know, you can certainly, again, starts with you kind of idea. You know, you could certainly even just begin by getting some ideas from some of the great resources out there.
Absolutely. So now it seems we have some more questions coming in. Someone's asking for a list of schools that have found effective interventions in place of seclusion and restraint. And again, I can just mention a few quickly. So if you look on the Ukeru Systems website, we have archived webinars that discussions with other schools that have already been able to replicate our results from Grafton and are seeing great success. So we're talking about, for instance, Mill Creek Township School District in Erie, outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, Berkeley County Public Schools in South Carolina. And again, if anyone listening would like to have more information about what's happening around Ukeru in their state, if on the slides there you see we have an info@ukerusystems.com email address, please drop me a line, drop me an email through there. I'm happy to engage with the conversation and give you, again, more examples and details about the state that you're in. Yeah, if someone's asking if we've done any training for law enforcement officers yet. Honestly, we're in talks with some, I guess you could say, law enforcement training academies in a couple states about being able to train in trauma-informed care. Absolutely. People are asking, how have we basically seen the reductions that we've been able to see in other school districts? So if you go on the Ukeru Systems website, that's going to give you a lot of information. But basically what we're doing is we're giving an alternative. We're offering our staff a physical alternative to restraint to keep them safe, as well as then a more philosophical approach through trauma-informed approaches and comfort versus control.
So, Kim, there's been sorry, go ahead.
No, Juliet, please go.
Oh, I was just going to say, we just had a huge influx of questions, and I think I'm just looking at the time, and some of these are really fantastic questions about specific interventions and things of that nature. I'm not sure we have time to answer them now, and I just am starting to think we might need to have another webinar.
Yeah, absolutely, because again, I do want to be mindful of people's time and schedule and guys' schedule. So here's what we can do. Number one, we are going to post this webinar on our website so you could share it with people. We will also, we will try to take the questions that are coming in, and maybe, Juliet, we can answer some of those and send them out in an email blast to folks who had signed up to join this webinar. And then we highly encourage, again, you have Guy's contact information, you have Ukeru's contact information there. Please reach out to us. I hope that you have been able to hear today. We are both so very passionate about this movement, and we want to help you. We want to do everything we can to help you. So, Guy, in closing, like any words of wisdom for us?
Well, I'm gonna do this a dual purpose. I see one last question hanging in the window here. I know we have more, but I'll close with that last question because I think it's a good one to close on. And that person asked, how do we encourage our local school districts to want to learn about your program? So that's a good point to close on because, really that's what we want to happen. Whether you're a parent or you're a teacher, we want you to share this information. It's not always easy. I began by, initially sending an email to a special education supervisor and sharing it, and she was kind of interested. And then I sent it to her supervisor, and I initially didn't get much of a response, but I kept persisting. And at one point, since I've been working with Kim, I actually did an introductory email where I said, "Hey Kim, I want to introduce you to the head of special education for our county, so and so." I've been telling her about the Ukeru program. Whatever it takes, if you want to make a meeting with a member of the Board of Education, again, my closing message to you would be, we can and must do better, and doing anything you can make a difference. So I would just encourage you to take any action you can, because that action could save a life. It really could. So I thank anybody that's kind of standing up to want to see a change here. Kim, you and I are very, very passionate about this, and we definitely want to see a change, and I think we can do so much better. So I'll leave it at that. But if anybody has any questions or follow-up, they can reach me through the Alliance website or the Facebook page. If you're not on the Facebook page already, I'd encourage you to like that. We've got a lot of great information there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we totally agree. Follow Guy, look him up, social media, as well as Ukeru. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and we'd love for you to join us. And thank you. I can't thank everyone enough. I know everyone has super busy schedules, and it means a lot that so many people took this hour out of their day to join us. And Guy, this is only the beginning. So yeah. I have no doubt that
we got more work to do. We got more work to do. Yeah,
we do. We definitely do, and it's truly a joy to talk with you and to do this work with you. And again, we will do so much more together. And thank you so much for your time today. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day and week. Thank you.